Hello, hello, and welcome to episode 3 of Podcasting for Educators. Today is a special episode because I have on my very first guest, Sara Marye. Sara is a TPT seller and the CEO of the Stellar Teacher Company. Sara has over a decade of experience working as a classroom teacher and school administrator. She's a literacy specialist passionate about helping elementary teachers around the world grow their students into lifelong readers. She's also the host of the Stellar Teacher podcast, where she loves to share her favorite literacy tips every week. Sara is also a client of mine and just the most amazing person to be around. We have an awesome conversation about how she intentionally uses her podcast episodes to help plan other pieces of her business, fears she had about getting started, and how her podcast has helped her impact so many teachers around the world. If you are considering starting your own podcast or you already have an existing show, you're going to love this episode because Sara gives so many great tips and takeaways. Let's get started. Welcome to Podcasting for Educators, the podcast that helps TPT authors and other online educators launch and grow their show. I'm Sara, and I'm on a mission to help you get your podcast out and into the ears of those who need it most: busy teachers, counselors, literacy specialists, SLPs, parents, and everyone in between. Each week, we'll cover quick tips, strategies, and podcast industry updates so that you can be on top of your podcasting game and gain some new customers along the way. Are you ready? Let's get to it. Sara, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. This is like so much fun that I get to have a podcast interview with my podcast manager.
I know. It's so exciting. It's fun for me too, to be on the other side of things. So I figured we could start by you just sharing a little bit about your background in education and how you made the transition from being in the classroom, I know you were a vice principal, so making that transition from being at the school to starting your TPT business.
Yeah. So in case your audience doesn't know, I'm Sara Marye, and I am the creator behind the Stellar Teacher Company, and I have the podcast, the Stellar Teacher Podcast. And I have been doing this full time for about 3 years now. And prior to that, I was a 4th grade teacher. I was an instructional coach. I was an assistant principal. And I kind of mentioned this in my very first podcast, but I have always been really motivated by this idea of like making an impact in education. And that's what got me out of the classroom in the first place, is I realized that I could have an impact not only on the 25 students in my classroom, but I could have an impact on the entire campus. And so I moved into the assistant principal role. And then, as my career kind of developed, I was at sort of a crossroad between either becoming a principal or doing something completely different. And I have always loved creating resources. I've always loved the curriculum side of things. I've always loved supporting teachers. And I was doing less of that as an assistant principal than I sort of had hoped. And so rather than continuing down that path, I had made the decision to pursue, I guess, having my own business and focusing on the curriculum and the professional development side of things. And I had started doing Teachers Pay Teachers. I don't know. It seems like forever ago, but I guess just like 5 years ago. So when I was still working in a school, it was, I think my last year of working in 4th grade is when I started. And that slowly just like grew over time. So kind of when I was at this point in my career, I was like, okay, I'm going to make this my full-time job because it gives me the opportunity to have the biggest impact, because now not only am I impacting a school or a campus, but I connect with teachers all over the world. And I have my reading membership site that has, teachers literally from all over the world. And it's just so fun for me. And yeah, I've just always sort of chased this idea of where can I have the biggest impact in education. So that's kind of how I got to where I'm at.
Awesome. So you started your TPT store just 5 years ago?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. 2016 or 2015. Oh, I guess maybe 6 years ago, 2015, the summer of 2015 is when I started.
Wow. So you've made a ton of growth in just a few years, which is pretty amazing.
It's a little wild to think. I remember when I first started, I was like, oh, if I can make enough money to like pay for Starbucks every month,
yes.
or like if I can make enough money to, pay my cable bill. And so the fact that I'm doing this full time and, it's not necessarily, like I said, like the fact that I'm able to do this full time and support myself and, my career and my team, it's great. But it's really about like the fact that it's like, okay, I get to help all of these teachers. It's really, really neat.
Yes, I totally agree. And that word impact comes up a lot in the TPT space. And that's really part of the reason that I'm starting this podcast and why I love podcasts so much is because it really does totally extend your reach to people all over the world. Every single week you can be in their ear. So I love it. Now, by the time that you and I cross paths, you had said that you were considering starting a podcast for a while now. It was one of your goals for, let's see, 2020. At that time, it was one of your goals. So what was intriguing to you about starting a podcast? Why was that something that you wanted to do?
I don't know. It's like one of those things where I love listening to podcasts. So I am just an avid podcast listener. I go for a walk almost every single day. And so I love listening to podcasts when I'm walking. When I was commuting to school, I would listen to podcasts. I like them so much more, I think, than blog posts because I feel so much more connected to the person speaking and delivering the content. So I've always liked them. I think it was just one of those things where I sort of realized I was like, wait a minute, all these people that have podcasts, like they're just normal people. It's not like they have like a degree in podcasting or anything. It was just, they wanted to start a podcast and they did. And so I've always, one of those things that kind of once I realized that any regular person can start a podcast. And then of course, when I started my business and I had a blog, I don't particularly like writing. And so I have a blog and I publish blog posts, but it's not like a passion of mine, but I love teaching. I love talking. I always loved doing, professional development when I was in schools. And so I was like, okay, if I started a podcast, it'd be like little mini professional development sessions every week, which would just be so much fun for me. And then just this idea of being able to connect with the teachers in my audience on a much more personal level. And so it is something that I have been, well, now I have one and I feel so accomplished that I've actually started and stuck with this, mostly thanks to you. But I want to say it was like in August of 2018 is when I first mentioned this idea to my husband of I want to start a podcast. And my husband is the best supporter and the best cheerleader. And anytime I have an idea, he's like, yes, you should do this and you'd be great at it. So as soon as I mentioned to him, I want to start a podcast, he bought me a podcast microphone and he downloaded software on my computer and he was like, you are all ready to go. Start recording your podcasts whenever you want. And then it was 2 years later before I did anything with it. So I definitely had been sitting on this idea of wanting to start a podcast for a long time before I took any action in making it happen.
Oh my gosh. I feel like husbands don't get enough credit sometimes.
Mine certainly does not. He needs way more credit than he gets.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I hear you. My husband's the same way. Like exactly what you said. I'm so lucky. He supports me in everything I do. And they're definitely behind the scenes, but without them, a lot of things in online business would not be possible for sure. So, okay, I have to ask, do you remember what your favorite or what your first podcast was that you ever listened to?
Oh my goodness.
Like, do you have one that really?
I don't know what my first one was. I think It was probably, I listened to a bunch of health ones and fitness ones. Those kind of come and go. Actually, no, I take that back. I do know the first podcast I listened to. It was the Serial podcast.
Okay. I was wondering if you're going to say that. I feel like
and I kind of forget about that one because it was just it was more entertaining. And most of the podcasts I listen to are self-help or business related. But yeah, when that came out, and I remember I was so just enthralled with that story and listening to it. And I remember I sat on my patio one day for probably 4 hours, just drinking coffee, listening to this podcast. I was like, this is amazing. So yeah, Serial was my very first podcast.
It was mine as well. We were driving back from Nashville, Tennessee, and we just binged to and from there. And I was hooked ever since listening to Serial. And I think a lot of people have that story too. But speaking to your point that you don't have to be a radio host or have audio background or speaking background or even a bunch of fancy equipment to start a podcast, which is definitely a myth, I think, in the podcasting world. And a reason that a lot of people don't start right away is because they think that you have to have all this experience, but literally anybody can start a podcast.
I still record my podcast in my closet. with a bunch of pillows for the sound. And I used the microphone that my husband bought me. It was a Blue Yeti. I mean, I think it was like, I don't know how much it was, not that expensive. And I have a free software on my computer. So yeah, it was, but I think kind of, to your point, before I got started and before you and I connected, I knew I wanted to start a podcast and I knew there was steps that I needed to take. And I didn't do enough of the research to like clarify what I had to do. And so in my head, I had made it this much more complicated process than it actually was.
Yes.
And I think that's why I never actually took action, because I was like, oh my gosh, I don't have time to start a podcast. Like, I don't know how to do all of these things. Like, there's no way I can make this happen. So rather than actually like figuring out what are all of the steps that I need to take, I was just like, I can't do it. And so I waited for a long time. And then you came into my life and all the magic happened.
Yes. So Sara had posted a job opportunity on, it's called Michaela Quinn. She has a program that helps women, a lot of former teachers actually, start their own online businesses. And she has a hire board. And Sara had posted looking for a different position, but she had mentioned her podcast in the job posting. And I sent her an email and said, you need a separate person for your podcast. And that person is me. And we got on a call and the rest is history. I'm so glad that we connected.
Oh my gosh, me too. Seriously, it's been like one of the best decisions I have ever made for my business. And it's like, I'm always telling my husband, like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad that I found Sara, or more so that Sara found me, because seriously, without you, like my podcast would not happen every week. And I absolutely love it. It has quickly become, one of my favorite parts of my business. But if it was just me, there is no way that it would happen every week.
No, I love that. And I love hearing you say that it's one of your most favorite parts of your business, because that's what I want for people, is for this to be a fun experience, not stressful. And we'll get into how you manage all of that in just a second. When people first decide that they want to start a podcast, they go to Google or YouTube, and then it's like that wave of overwhelm. And whereas when you work with a podcast manager, they list everything out for you, so you know exactly what you need to do and what you don't need to do. Because when you start that Google search, there's so many options where like who to host with and what equipment to use and all of that. So definitely having somebody to make those decisions for you or help you make those decisions makes it a little less overwhelming and scary.
Oh, absolutely. It does. I mean, I remember when it's like because I thought about this, and there were various points in the 2 years from when I first had the idea to when it happened, that I was like, okay, this year I'm going to make it happen. And I'd go to Google, and of course I'd be like, you need to buy this course. And I'm like, I don't have time to take a course on podcasting. I've got other things I'm doing. So yeah, having somebody help with like the launch process and getting it started was just a game changer.
Yes, totally. And I was just telling Sara before we jumped on that this episode is part of my launch episodes, but I was letting her know I'm already 100% positive that I will be hiring my own podcast manager, because I will need that accountability to keep things going week to week. Everybody needs help.
Oh, for sure.
So let's talk a little bit about how you use your podcast to help with the planning of content in your business week to week, because you do an awesome job. You podcast the smart way, which is you batch your episodes, and then you use your podcast episodes. You repurpose your podcast episodes into different parts of your business, which is absolutely the way to do it, because think about your podcast episodes as this piece of macro content that you can then break into smaller chunks. So first, talk to us about how you record your episodes and what your process is there.
Yeah. So, I appreciate the compliment. I'm definitely learning how to like use my podcast. And it's interesting, just like thinking about when I first started, I was like, I need a podcast episode. What can I talk about? And then I would record this episode, or I'd record a few episodes ahead. And now it has definitely turned into almost like the skeleton or like the backbone of my business that we plan sort of like everything else around. And so I try to batch my podcasts. I have learned that I enjoy recording so much more when I am like, great, I have my podcast recorded for the entire month. Like, let me think about what I want to talk about, in October, November, or, far enough ahead. And this really started, this sort of like using my podcast as like the backbone for my business kind of started this summer when I was getting ready to prepare for my membership launch. And I was thinking about, the 5 weeks leading up to when the doors to my membership are open, like what are all of the pieces of information that my audience might need to like hear, or they might have questions about, or what things are they going to be researching over the summer? And so I thought about what is coming up in my business? And then with the time of year, like what are teachers, they're planning their literacy block. They're thinking about scheduling. They're thinking about all of the elements of reading workshop, and so I kind of planned my content from that, but then it's, kind of going a little bit further. So I typically try to think about my planning in almost like a month. I typically look at a month at a time. And so I think about the time of the year. I try to look to see if there's any, whether it's like holidays or sales or promotionals, and just thinking about, okay, what are teachers going to be needing to like hear about? And I like doing almost like little, I don't know, whether it's like mini series or like episodes that are connected together. It gives then teachers a sort of like, oh, I want to tune in next week to hear about the same thing. I just finished recording like a mini series on mini lessons, but over the summer, everything that I talked about had to do with like how to schedule out your reading block. Towards the end of the year, it was how to keep students engaged at the end of the year. So I try to keep all of my episodes sort of connected. So I just kind of start with like, what are my topics? Like, what are the 4 topics that I want to cover in the month, and try to have them connect to each other in some capacity. And then I'll go through and like outline them, obviously, before I start recording them. And then once I have my podcast outlined and recorded, then this is where we say, okay, this week we're, doing an episode on mini lessons. So we want to share about it, twice on Instagram, and we want to share blog posts that are also connected to mini lessons. We want to share the freebies that we have that are connected to mini lessons. We want to, repurpose a Facebook Live that I did about the same topic that might sort of include some similar information, but provide some new little nuggets. We want to, if I have any resources that teachers can use to teach mini lessons, we want to promote those. So it kind of becomes almost like the guide for everything we share on social media and what I share with my email list. Because, it's like if I'm talking about podcasts on the mini lessons, I want to direct my audience to listen to the podcast. And then once teachers have listened to the podcast, I want to give them, whether it's a freebie to download, a blog post to read, or something else they can now do with that new knowledge that I've shared with them in the podcast.
Awesome. So smart. So you've got your episodes, and then you've got social media posts on your Instagram stories, your email list, and then you're also sharing those other resources that you already have. Do you use Pinterest as well, right?
We do. I use Pinterest. Pinterest has been a hot mess this year. So we use it, and I definitely share. It's like you give me an audiogram. So it shares like a little snippet. I know Pinterest tends to favor videos. And so we'll just turn that audiogram into like a video and upload it to Pinterest and link it to my website as well. So I try to share it on all platforms. I feel like it tends to work better on Instagram and Facebook, but it's one of those things where it's like, hey, if we have the content, if it exists, let's put it on as many platforms as we possibly can.
Yes. Yes. And Sara has her show notes. We put those on her website. So then we can link to other internal links on her site, like related blog posts, related episodes, and then of course her resources from her TPT store. So tell me, I know, at least I think you get good feedback from your listeners, right? How do they usually reach out to you if they want to contact you about the podcast?
I do. And this is, I think, one of my favorite parts about having the podcast is the connection that I have with my listeners. Most of the time, and I think it's because in my podcast, I mentioned, like, if you want to reach out to me, connect with me on Instagram at the Stellar Teacher Company. I think I say that at the end of pretty much every episode. And so, every week I'll get a direct message from somebody that was like, I just listened to your podcast and, I loved it. Or I just discovered your podcast this summer and it was so helpful. Or I've never done a mini lesson before and I just listened to your episode, whatever it is, they reach out to me and just saying that they've enjoyed the episode, like they appreciate it. And then what I love even more is when teachers tell me that they've listened to it, is when teachers request episodes. And I try to sort of like, let my audience know that you can reach out to me at any point in time and let me know like what episodes that I want to record. And for a while in the spring, as when I was kind of getting started with this, like most of the episodes that I recorded came as a result of a listener request. Someone said, can you do an episode on book talks? Can you do an episode on book clubs? Can you do an episode on test prep or whatever it is? And I was like, yes, absolutely. Because,
and thank you for giving me,
right. You just made my job a whole lot easier because now I don't need to think of a topic, and that's like the whole reason why I do the podcast, is because I want it to be helpful for teachers. And so when I hear back from them, that is it's so much more motivating for me to want to record. And then if anything, it makes recording so much easier because now rather than talking to my closet or to myself, or to my dogs who inevitably interrupt every single podcast episode in some capacity, I have this teacher in mind and it's like, okay, I'm recording this episode for this specific teacher. And it makes it so much easier, I think, to like have it feel conversational and not feel like I'm reading a script or an outline, and just, it seems so much more purposeful. So I love when my audience reaches out to me. And so I definitely try to encourage them in my podcast episodes to connect with me in some capacity. And I love it. It's great.
Yes. I think that that's like the ultimate compliment as a podcast host, is to be able to have people directly reach out to you, specifically saying which episodes they loved, what they took away from it, how it's helping them. I think another hesitation that some people have is that they're afraid that they're not going to be able to have topics every single week, but especially TPT sellers, I always say, like, every single one of your resources can be an entire podcast episode, if not multiple podcast episodes. And if you're ever stuck, you can always ask your audience via email. Like, if you have a weekly newsletter, you can ask them what they want to hear. You could do a poll on your Instagram stories, but asking for that direct feedback and specific topics is so, so helpful for you, for your idea generation. And also just so you know that you're speaking on something that you know that your audience wants. So,
yeah. Well, and I mean, I think I had that same sort of fear, and that was one of the things where I was like, I don't want to start something if I can't release an episode every week. And I love talking, but how am I going to find something related to reading that I can talk about every single week? And it is really amazing how the more episodes I record, the more ideas I get. And I mean, I have podcast ideas for days. And I think the other thing is I've realized is that at first I was thinking these episodes had to be long and they had to have all of this like new information and they had to be really like revolutionary. And the episodes that I feel like the teachers connect with the most are the ones that are really short. I try to keep mine less than 20 minutes, and they have maybe 3 key points. And it doesn't have to be anything where it's like, I'm trying to teach them this brand new strategy or something that's like super complex, like save that for, a course or a Facebook Live or something, but it's just 3 quick things that they can do to teach inferencing, or it's like, here's the framework that I use for my small group lessons, whatever it is. And it's short and it's, here's my key point. Here's why it works. Here's a little anecdotal story. Let's move on to the next one. And so when you think about that, these episodes are really meant to be like short, and concise, then all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute, I don't actually have enough time to even share everything that I want to share on this topic. So let me roll it into another episode, so once you get started, you realize that there is really an unlimited number of things that you can talk about.
Yes, there really are. And it's amazing if you sit down on like a Google Doc and you start outlining your ideas, you might think that it's going to be a short episode and then you start talking and it's 45 minutes later.
I'm always like, okay, I got to keep this one shorter. It's like, well, make this 4 points instead of 5 because I always have more things I want to say. And then once you start talking, it's like, okay, wait a minute. I thought this was going to be, a 15-minute episode and it turned into a 22-minute episode very quickly.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's important to consider who your audience is. Like, you're speaking to teachers who are so busy. And I'm sure that a lot of them, when they listen to your episodes, they're on their commute to and from school. So I think that 20-minute mark is like the sweet spot for teachers and other educators just because of time. So it's definitely consider your audience when you're thinking about things like episode length, obviously topics. And I also want to jump back to, you mentioned when you did episodes during the summer and you were really, really intentional about the summer episodes because, again, your audience is teachers and summer is their time off. And we saw for you and other TPT clients of mine, numbers just spike during the summer because teachers have a little bit more time on their hands.
Well, and I remember I asked you, I was like, okay, Sara, like, how can I sort of like leverage the summer to grow my podcast audience? Because, I just started this thing in January, so it still is relatively new, but I want it to be a really impactful part of my business. And you suggested doing double episodes during the summer because teachers have more time to listen. And so I did 5 weeks of double episodes, and that was a little intimidating to batch out 10 episodes basically, ahead of time. Cause I was like, well, 2 episodes a week sounds great, but I'm only going to commit to this if I can record them ahead of time. And I did, but it ended up being so much fun. And I almost loved having the double episodes a week because it was 2 more like touch points that I could connect with my audience. And so it just made it, I don't know, like I felt like I was so connected with the teachers during the summer. And I know it's like, like you were saying, teachers consume a lot during the summer, but it was fun for me to be able to do those double episodes too.
Yeah, it was so fun. It was a huge success. And I loved, from my perspective, you also started your Facebook group as that summer series was going on. And I loved seeing teachers coming into the Facebook group, mentioning episodes that they had been listening to. So getting that feedback was so fun. But yeah, that was a smart move. And then we also discussed how the other time of the year that might be similar would be that winter break time. So think about that. If you are a TPT seller who's thinking about how you can plan maybe something special or different with your podcast, think about what you could do during the summer and then over winter break when teachers have a little bit more time and are able to give you a little bit more of their attention.
Yeah, I'm already starting to think, what are we going to do during that week? Some sort of like either extra episode or a little mini series. So yeah, definitely starting to think, how can we use that time?
Yes, we'll have to brainstorm. Now, you mentioned that was one of your fears, was coming up with enough episode topics every single week. So were there any other fears that you had starting out with your podcast?
I mean, I think I worried that I wouldn't have a good podcast voice.
Yeah, I remember
I was just like, oh my gosh, are people even going to want to like listen to me? So that was a fear that I had. I think I had a big fear of, what if I record this podcast and nobody listens to it? I think that's like with anything you do in business. What if I start this and then it like flops or fails? So yeah, I think the content, not having a good podcast voice, and then worrying about the fact that like, what if I start this and like, I can't get anybody to listen to it? And all 3 of those, I feel like I've realized were silly fears to hold me back from starting something.
Yes, maybe silly, but definitely common. I think that those are all common. I don't know anybody who loves hearing themselves talk,
I don't love it, but I've also gotten in the habit of starting to listen to myself, listen to my podcast every week, because I realize that, and it's not so much like the sound of my voice, but I realize whether it is like the energy that I bring. Like in my head, I am like the most energetic like person. But there was a couple episodes I was like, I sound flat. Like I just sound like I'm not engaging. And so listening to that, I was like, okay, I need to change sort of just like the way that I phrase things, or the energy or the enthusiasm that I'm bringing to it, or even the pacing of it. It's like, oh, I'm a fast talker in general. And I have to remind myself that it's like, okay, I need to slow down a little bit. So even just like being aware of the pacing, or how long something is, or how many, examples I share. So I have found it to be really helpful to actually go back and listen to my podcast episodes, because it really gives me an idea of like what my audience is hearing and how I can just even improve the delivery of it.
Yes, I think that's so smart to listen. I've had clients who want to launch a podcast, but they don't even listen to podcasts. And I always tell people you should listen, because you can get a feel for what you want your podcast to be like. But it is good to listen to yourself and maybe hear some things that you want to improve, or like you said, the energy. That is so true. You feel like you're super amped up and energetic. Is there anything that you do to like amp yourself up before sitting down to record? Or do you ever sit down and you're like, no, I can't do this right now?
Yeah, it's probably more often than not, I will, get in my closet, close the door and be like, this is not happening, And so, I've sort of realized like kind of like little nuances about recording podcasts. I tend to have more energy in the morning, and maybe it's the caffeine or maybe it's the fact that I haven't done any work. And I've also sort of like realized that like 3 podcasts in a day is my max. And so I try to batch all of my episodes for the month ahead of time, but I can't do more than 3 in a day. So I either do 2 and 2 or 3 and then 1. And then I think other things that I just like remind myself is like to smile while I'm speaking, which maybe sounds silly, but it's like when you smile, you just have like more energy, And so I remind myself that it's like, okay, if I'm really excited and passionate about what it is that I'm talking about, I want that to come across in my content. And when I go back and listen to some episodes, I was like, oh yeah, you can tell that I'm like really pumped up about this topic, and then there's other ones where I was like, I probably could have worked on that a little bit, but, just reminding myself that it's like, okay, smiling is going to just make me sound, cheerier, or I try to like have like the upspeak. So it's like, just making sure that it's like I am ending on a, positive note, just all of those things and I wouldn't have realized that, I think, if I didn't go back to listen to it. So just, reminding myself that I'm still in the first year of my podcast. I'm still learning. I definitely have like a lot of room to grow and improve. But like I said, I want my podcast to be a really impactful and big part of my business. And so knowing that, I have to pay attention to it. I have to revise it. I have to try new things. I have to, not be willing to, I don't know. I can't be afraid of the sound of my own voice and like not ever go back and listen to it. So I'm trying to be reflective and intentional about just with the plan and the execution. So that way I can get it to the point to where it is, the big main part of my business.
Yes. Oh my gosh. You just said so many amazing things. And I think it's so important if you're going to start a podcast, or if you already have a podcast and you have a business, to really think of this as an important piece of your business and treat it like that too. Plan for it like you would plan for your social media content or any other blog post or anything else that you do in your business, so that you can really get the most out of it. And you are rocking it.
Well,
I think you've had an awesome first year.
Well, it's because I have an awesome podcast manager.
I love it. You're like my ultimate hype girl. Sara was the first TPT author that I worked with, and she has introduced me to so many others. So I'm so grateful to be working with you and having you as a friend. I feel like we're friends now, and I need to get down to Florida and visit you one weekend.
Yes, you do. I agree though. I feel like, because we chat all the time on Boxer, yes, and you're so good about helping me with questions. And I feel like, you edit my podcast and upload them and all of that. But when it comes to like marketing or strategy, or even just like general business things, I'm like, ooh, Sara would know about this. So I just appreciate how I feel like you've jumped in and are just as invested in my business as I am to some degree. And I just appreciate that. But let me just give a little plug. You did not ask me to do this, but let me just say, you seriously are like an amazing podcast editor. So anybody who is listening to this that is on the fence about starting a podcast, if they can handle it, do it first of all, but then follow up and get Sara to be your podcast manager, because she really does make it so simple and so easy. And so whatever your fears are, I promise that she will be able to relieve those. So yeah,
you've
been great. You've been great to work with.
Thank you so much. I know you all can't see me right now, but my smile is just about as big as it could possibly get. Thank you so much. So, okay, I know we're running up to our time here, but I guess the last thing I would love to ask you is there anything that we haven't touched on, that any piece of advice that you would give to someone who is thinking about starting a podcast that might be a little bit hesitant?
I mean, I think just so often, and this is with anything in business, and one of the things I'm starting to become aware of is the fact that, I was a teacher. I was just a teacher, and I had this idea to start a business and help teachers through my blog, my podcast, my membership, my TPT store, all of that. But there are so many teachers out there who are just as knowledgeable, just as talented as I am. And I just feel like the world of education needs more people to support and cheerlead and encourage like teachers. And so my encouragement is for anybody who's listening and is maybe on the fence, like rather than considering why are all of the reasons why this could not work, like what am I scared of? Like what could go wrong? Like spend some time thinking about what are all of the things that could go right if I start a podcast? Like what are all of the things, the positive things that could come as a result of it? Think about like the possibility that you could have, the teachers, the students that you could impact, or even if it's not in education, just, I feel like the world they need connection. They need that human interaction. They need other people to validate and support and encourage. And podcasting is such a great platform to do that. So if you are on the fence about it, stop thinking about what you're worried about, what you're nervous about, and just spend some time thinking about, okay, how could this become like a really powerful and just, I don't know, a platform that I could use to support and encourage just other people who are on their journey. So that's I guess the one last little thing that I'd want to leave people with.
So perfectly said. And that is like my whole mission for my business is educating and getting people to understand how needed podcasts are in this space. Like podcasting has really blown up, but it is still such a small number compared to like the number of blogs out there. But then when you really narrow in on the teacher space, the educator space, there are not nearly enough shows out there that are supporting teachers, guidance counselors, all these educators that really need it. And I say this, Sarah's probably heard me say this a million times, but every time I listen to your episodes, I just tell myself, like, I wish I had this when I was in the classroom, because you go through college and then you start teaching and you're like,
nobody told me how to do this.
It's happening. Yeah. Like, what in the world? I don't know what I'm doing. And it's overwhelming. And when you can have someone come in who's been in your shoes before, who's taught the things that you're teaching and is able to make that a little bit easier for you, it's a really, really powerful thing. So I am 100% on board with you. I think that there needs to be way more educators who start podcasts, because your impact is, it's endless. So I love that we're kind of ending on the topic of impact, because we started that way as well.
I'm a full circle here. It's great.
Yes, full circle. I love it. Well, thank you so much for coming on. You are amazing. Your podcast is amazing. And I will be sure to link your podcast, your website, your socials, everything, so that my listeners can check you out.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sarah. This was so much fun.
Thanks so much for tuning in today. Check out the show notes for any links and resources that were mentioned. If you have questions, takeaways, or just want to say hi, send me a message over on Instagram at Podcasting for Educators. Bye for now.